Hello listeners, this talk is partly in response to some comments asked by Bleakunending about the children of hippies, but it's also going to involve a few digressions into other topics, both past and present. I'm going to talk about the alt-right a bit. I'm also going to talk about some things from earlier on in my life that might be interesting to people. I hope they will. They're certainly different to a lot of things that are in my life now. But anyway, here's what Bleakunending asked me. Could you do a video about the children of people who dropped out of society in the 1970s? That really interests me, since I'm interested in permaculture and alternative living, etc. Do you think the children of these commune people turned out to be normies, who didn't share their parents' beliefs and didn't want to stay in the commune? Thank you for your questions, Bleakunending. As I just said before, hopefully you'll find this interesting with all of the digressions, and I'm going to try to relate it to my own life and also the alt-right. So here we go. Permaculture is a pretty interesting topic. For those of you who don't know what permaculture is, it's actually quite involved, but basically it's a sort of it's a way of designing systems for growing food and that sort of stuff. It's a lot more than that though, but it's about a very particular philosophical way of coming at this, and it's about design, all sorts of things. It's very complex. So if you're interested, go and look it up. It is an interesting topic to me, and I think that alternative living in general is something that people on the alt-right need to at least consider, if not investigate. Because I think that being a complete normie, someone who is completely invested in the current state of affairs, the current status quo, society, commuting to work and working a 9-to-5 job and all of that sort of stuff, I think that that's actually going to be quite bad in the future, in the relatively near future. It's not going to work out particularly well for most normies, even those who are not on the alt-right, but especially those who are on the alt-right. I have a bit of a hobby horse about fertility rates, but I think that's justified because I think fertility rates are actually a very clear indication of the health and long-term sustainability of a society. They're probably the most direct way of measuring that, actually, because if you can't continue what you're doing for multiple generations, then you're probably not doing something that's really very healthy. And here we might want to consider something like the concept of the eternal return by Friedrich Nietzsche, which is a concept that basically you should live today as though you had to live it indefinitely. And by extension, we could say we should try to create our lifetimes or our societies and the way they function such that they would be able to exist indefinitely. And of course, everything's in flux, there are outside influences and so on, but nevertheless, based upon this way of coming at things, I think that fertility rates are being crushed by normie lifestyles today. But even beyond that, it just doesn't seem to be a very particularly good bargain for normies to become normies or to remain normies. The cost of living is increasing, and I know that governments lie about how they measure statistics. They do openly lie. You can look at things like, I think it's shadow stats. But also, just at face value, it doesn't make any sense. For instance, in Australia, real estate is doubling in price every 10 years or even less. There's no way that the official interest rate of being only a few percent, the official rate of inflation, of being only a few percent, is anywhere near accurate if housing, which is one of people's largest expenses, is doubling every decade. That's a 7% rate of inflation there. So, how is everything else so cheap? It's not. I mean, people know, they can see how much they're spending on groceries, they can see how much they're spending on electricity and so on. Certainly in countries like Australia. So, the cost of living is increasing, and that is going to become a real issue in the future, particularly housing, because we're seeing now that there's a sort of a permanent class of renters who are emerging. These people, they don't really have enough money to acquire anything significant in terms of assets and so on, or houses and that kind of thing. But they still have some excess money, and that's basically because they're not having kids. So that's where the excess money is coming from, and they're just blowing that money on garbage, complete garbage. Or you have people who are still trying to maintain somewhat of a normie lifestyle, middle class existence in the suburbs with kids and jobs and all of that sort of stuff. And those people are slowly drowning in an ocean of debt. Or it's somewhere between those two for some people. But nevertheless, this is not a sustainable state of affairs. And I think it will come to a head at some point. But also, these people are actually not very happy. They're really stressed and they're really unhappy. They're really dissatisfied with their lives. And there are all sorts of ways you can measure this, whether it's looking at people engaging in retail therapy and that sort of thing, or actual therapy, as in something like 25% of American women are on antidepressants. That's not a healthy state of affairs, and it can't last. And those women are not having children and all of that sort of stuff. And there are certain very large forces that are occurring, whether those are immigration, so the importation of cheaper labour or labour to suppress increases in people's income, or globalization, which is essentially the opposite effect where you outsource the labour and the jobs, or automation. These three things mean that people have less job security than ever before, so they have to really watch what they do. And they have to work harder. There's more stress. There's more credentialism, just acquiring useless bits of paper, spending lots of time and money, often incurring debt in order to do that as well. But people are sort of running faster and faster on this hamster wheel and not going anywhere, of course. And I think that in the not too distant future, it might be a few years yet, it's always hard to say exactly, but in the not too distant future, people are going to be completely screwed by this. The social contract is going to break down. Societies won't be able to maintain their current levels of services and the general standard of living and all of this sort of stuff. And I think that when the crunch time comes, when this happens, it might not be one sudden event. It's probably more likely to be a kind of a series of steps, like walking down a staircase. It goes down a bit, then it levels off, then it goes down a bit, then it levels off, and so on. And it's basically just a jagged movement downwards rather than a dramatic drop like falling off a cliff. But nevertheless, I think that when this crunch comes, and it may come for different people at different times and so on and so forth, but those who are completely connected to the system and thus completely dependent upon the system are going to find themselves in a world of pain. If not literal pain, as in it could be very dangerous. There could be a real breakdown in social order and a massive spike in crime, particularly violent crime and so on. And it could be very dangerous for a lot of people. And that's bad enough for normies, but for people on the alt-right, I think that they're going to be in an even more precarious situation, because I think that there's going to be a crackdown, quite possibly this year, if not next year. There's going to be a crackdown upon the alt-right and the right-wing in general, because a lot of people who have power currently are starting to get very concerned about the rise of the alt-right. And they need to do something about it. From their point of view, they will need to do something about it. And they're going to start cracking down on this, and people are going to be kicked off social media, or there's going to be a lot of doxing. People are going to be reported to their companies for having the wrong political views and all of this sort of stuff. So even more than all of the normal issues that affect normies in terms of immigration and the importation of labour, outsourcing via globalization or automation, these people could be fired simply for having the wrong political opinions. And if they're swimming in an ocean of debt and all of this sort of stuff, then they're really going to be in a lot of pain. So I think that to some extent, opting out of all of this, out of the mainstream society, is a good thing and probably even a necessary thing. Having said that, I don't think that opting out completely is really that feasible, at least at this point in time. So, nevertheless, I think that some of that could be good. So, I'll tell you a few things about my past and when I was younger. Many years ago, I was actually quite interested in permaculture and alternative living. I lived in rural Victoria. Victoria is one of the states of Australia. I lived in Victoria for a couple of years, in rural Victoria for a couple of years, and I started doing some of this stuff, growing my own food and so on. And I read a lot about this, both online and in books. I bought some books about this stuff and borrowed a lot from the library as well. But I also went around to a few places to see this in action. So one of the places I went to was a kind of a commune, if you like, in the state of Queensland. I went on a vacation with my girlfriend at the time, and I had heard about this place, and I found that it wasn't going to be too far away from where we were vacationing, so we went there and had a look. So that was all prior to me coming to Taiwan, and how I came to be in Taiwan is a whole other story in and of itself, sort of a bit of a detour in a way. But at that time, I was also considering moving to Japan, particularly a place called Shikoku, which is one of the 4 major islands of Japan. It's the smallest and sort of least developed, least populated as well in Japan. Because there were a few things I'd read about with that place. I was generally interested in Japanese culture, but there were a few things that also piqued my interest to do with permaculture and that kind of thing. So one of them was... and I should also say that island, it looks pretty interesting. There's some other interesting things there. For instance, you can do surfing there, and you can also do this. There's a Buddhist pilgrimage there, where you walk around the island and you visit 88 temples. You get a stamp on each one and do all this stuff, and you walk these long distances. So I think it's about 1,400 kilometers. It takes a couple of months to do, and some of the temples are in pretty remote areas and very scenic areas and so on. So there's kind of some interesting stuff there. I was interested in looking at some of that stuff. But also, the two things in particular were, firstly, there was a guy called Alex Kerr, who I believe it was back in the 70s that this happened. He noticed that at that time, that generation of Japanese were emptying out of the countryside into the major cities. And there were a lot of traditional houses, many of them centuries old, traditional farmhouses and so on, that were being abandoned. And this was a sort of a piece of Japan's history and culture and so on that was being lost. So he found one of these houses on the island of Shikoku, and I believe he bought it. I'm not sure exactly, but anyway, he acquired this house somehow, and I believe it's called Flute House. That's the translation of the Japanese name. And I think he got some other people involved, and they fixed it up and so on, and in traditional ways and all of that sort of stuff. And then they also started producing their own food and all of this sort of stuff. And you can actually go there and live at this place. You can go there for a weekend, or you can go there for years. And the longer you're there, the more involved you become with running the place and maintaining it and so on. So I was interested in doing that for a time, maybe going there for 6 months or something to experience some of that stuff. And also on Shikoku, there's a center there that I believe was either established by or by some of this guy's followers, a guy called Masanobu Fukuoka, who wrote a book a really long time ago called One Straw Revolution. I think it was written in the 30s or the 40s, the 50s, something like that, or that's when he did the research for this stuff. He was a scientist, but he started to do sort of more naturalistic means of agriculture and horticulture and so on. And he wrote a book in response to this called One Straw Revolution, and it was all about how to use rice and barley and all this sort of stuff, growing that in a natural way. So that was also on Shikoku, and that was kind of interesting to me. I wanted to go and check that out. Um, but a large part of my problem back then, in terms of all of this stuff to do with permaculture and so on, that I was interested in, was a lack of capital to primarily to acquire land. But some other things as well, obviously, the operational costs and so on. But a lack of capital, and also the work issue, because I was, you can't just do this overnight. It's something you have to build up to, and you have to live in the meantime, obviously. And I was thinking about how I could do that, various businesses. But I was working as a teacher. I wasn't really happy with being a teacher, teaching in Australia. I was dealing with a lot of pretty feral kids, actually. Um, and so one thing led to another, and I ended up in, well, I was going to go to Japan, but I ended up in Taiwan instead. And that's a whole other story. But nevertheless, I'm still interested in a lot of this stuff. I still have a lot of the books I bought back then, including some of the seminal books. There was a guy called John Seymour, I believe he's dead now, who wrote a book called The New Complete Book of Self-Sufficiency. Well, originally it was The Complete Book of Self-Sufficiency, but the one I've got is the updated version. And that's actually a pretty good book. And another one called Permaculture, A Designer's Manual by Bill Mollison, who was actually Australian, and he started the permaculture movement. And that's kind of the textbook of permaculture. It's a real tome of a thing. It's probably about 2 inches thick, actually. So I still have some of those books, and I'm still interested in this. I still have this dream of one day doing some of this stuff. Now, how I got into all of this was I called myself a libertarian for probably, I was over a decade. I think it was maybe about 13 years. And I realized that as long as we were really tapped into the system, and by the system I mean both the government and major corporations and all of this stuff, having normal jobs, the whole bit, as long as we were really connected to all of that, then bigger forces, be they the government or corporations or whomever, would always be able to control us, because they'd always have us over a barrel, because we'd be living from one day to the next, or 1 week or 1 month to the next. We'd never really have any true measure of independence. You don't have independence if someone can cut off your food tomorrow. You don't have independence if they can cut off your water or electricity or any of this sort of stuff. Or, whether that's the government or a corporation, or if you're in some collapse scenario, the supermarkets would be empty within 2 hours of that happening. And you'd really be in trouble then. So I came to this realization, and I actually remember the exact moment when this happened, when this epiphany occurred. It was prior to coming back to Australia and then living in the countryside and doing that whole sort of thing. I was living and traveling in Europe, and I was in Hungary. I was in a hostel, and it was around Christmas. I think it was Christmas Eve, actually. I was talking to a couple of Canadian hippies, young hippie type people, and of course they were coming at this from a kind of a different angle than I was, and I didn't really tell them about all of my political ideas at the time and so on. But nevertheless, we were talking about how, I think we were specifically talking about jam. I think there was a jar of jam or something. We were talking about that, and how our grandparents had a whole lot of skills that we don't currently have. And, we're really weak as a result. Our grandparents were freer because they weren't dependent upon government and large corporations for basic foodstuffs. My grandparents used to have all sorts of stuff. My dad grew up in a suburban house with a large backyard, and they had this sort of menagerie of livestock in their backyard, and growing various plants and all of this sort of stuff. And they used to go out hunting and fishing and all of this sort of stuff. And those people were really capable, and they could actually fend for themselves to a certain extent. Many of us can't. I mean, I couldn't do a lot of that stuff these days. And as a result, we're really vulnerable. So I came to that realization then. And when I returned to Australia, probably, I think it was about 6 months, something like that, 6 months later, I began investigating various things. There was sort of there were a whole lot of things that at the time I didn't realize how connected they were, but they gradually became more connected, and I've sort of made this realization, this subsequent realization within the past few years. So I looked into self-sufficiency, and then moved out to and started growing stuff when I was living in Melbourne, and then I moved out of Melbourne and I was growing other stuff and doing all this stuff, and also understanding money. That sort of set me on that whole path towards learning about finance and economics and investing and all of that sort of stuff. That was all set in motion by that realization I had talking to those two people, and to this day I'm still interested in many of these things. For slightly different reasons, and because some of my political and philosophical ideas have changed, and I'm older, and a different set of life circumstances. And hopefully, I'm more mature, and I've learned stuff, and so on and so forth. But I'm still interested in some of this stuff. So my medium to long-term objective, in say 5 to 10 years, is that I will probably end up back in rural Victoria. I won't live in Melbourne again. I don't think I'll ever live in Melbourne again. I don't like Melbourne at all now. I will do that after I've sort of established my wealth or income, at least. Income streams, passive income and this kind of stuff. But that's where I'd like to be probably in 5 to 10 years. And there are other reasons too, so I can be around my family and that kind of thing, and be around other people of similar outlook on life and all of that kind of stuff. So I'll probably end up buying a house with several acres of land, at least a few acres, 2 or 3 acres or more, maybe up to 5 or 10, potentially more. And what I might do is, if it's feasible to do this, rent out some land to a local farmer, let him graze some livestock there, and either get him to pay me or pay me in kind, to give me some of the meat and so on. But basically to at least have a few acres for my own personal use. And I would try to produce some of my own food. So the easy stuff like vegetables, fruit, maybe some chickens, maybe some bees for honey, things that don't involve an enormous amount of work and that aren't really time consuming, and where you're really tied to that place. Large livestock, from what I can tell, are a massive hassle in terms of, you have to constantly look after them. You have to milk them, or there are always vets involved and all sorts of stuff. And if you're going to milk them, or even if you're going to slaughter them, there are a few chapters in that John Seymour book about slaughtering your own livestock and all this kind of stuff, and it just seems like it's a massive amount of work. So I don't think I'm really up for that kind of thing, maybe, but I doubt it. And it really ties you to one place, particularly if you have anything you have to milk, because you have to do it every day. So you can't even really go away for a vacation unless you can get someone else to look after your livestock, So I don't really want to do that kind of stuff, because I want to avoid anything that's going to become a full-time job. But certainly growing some of my own food, and potentially things like producing my own electricity, because it's something you can do pretty easily. Anything that would provide some measure of independence. Furthermore, I think doing this kind of thing would allow me to form certain connections with various other people, particularly on the alt-right, such that maybe we could trade some goods or services with one another, as well as have a general level of social interaction. Though for reasons that will become apparent when I get further into this talk, I think entering into any really formal cooperative type enterprises would be a bad idea. Now, certainly if I were to do this as any kind of commercial enterprise, or want to sell or trade some of these goods, and for other people in the alt-right, it's probably best that a lot of this is kept under the radar in terms of us just doing it, but not announcing to everyone, hey, we basically have this alt-right commune type thing, or organization of farmers or something, right? There's no sense in doxing ourselves in that regard. Likewise, there's no sense in trying to be some sort of complete purist, and saying that we're only going to interact with one another. that sort of thing's pretty unrealistic for reasons that will become apparent in later on in this talk. I just don't think those kinds of communes work particularly well. Sometimes they do, but generally they don't. And also because, as long as people aren't complete degenerates, I think it's worth interacting with them. They may not be fully red-pilled, but they might become more red-pilled, particularly if society got worse. So basically, I don't think full self-sufficiency is the way to go, because it's just too much work and it's really difficult. So I'm not thinking of attempting that, but I think partial self-sufficiency would be a good thing from a political standpoint, because, as I mentioned earlier, people on the alt-right are very vulnerable to people learning about their views and then getting them fired from their jobs, essentially. And I think it could be interesting and useful from an economic standpoint if we were to be able to trade. Then, obviously, if money isn't trading hands and there are no taxes involved, all of this sort of stuff. And then there are other benefits in terms of community, cutting out the pos, because you sort of avoid the most degenerate people who are only living a very degenerate lifestyle. By being self-sufficient, to some extent, you have to be pretty realistic, practical, and so on. So, that tends to cut a lot of the pos away by definition. And also, it's healthier. You know what you're eating, you know what you're putting into your body. A lot of modern food has all sorts of chemicals, hormones, who knows what's in it, right? And there are incidental benefits in terms of low-level exercise when you do manual labour in your yard and that kind of stuff. So I think it's something that should be considered, at least to some extent. So now I'm going to finally get around to discussing the questions that Bleakunending asked in his comments to me. And I'm going to talk about some of these people who dropped out of society in previous decades and their children. So, did those children become normies? Did they stay in the communes? What happened to them, essentially? Well, I think, as with any group of people who try to opt out of mainstream society for ideological reasons, whether those are religious or political or the environmental, whatever, but some sort of ideological reasons, quite a few of the children do leave the movement or the society or whatever that's established, and they return to the mainstream society and become normies, at least to some extent. They may never fully reintegrate, but at least partially, and their children probably end up fully integrated. Now, they leave for all sorts of reasons. In the most extreme cases, it's because of abuse, whether that's sexual, physical, psychological, but some form of abuse, or it could just be disillusionment with the thing in which they're raised. They don't really believe it. Their parents believed it, but they don't really believe it, or they're just sort of generally tempted by the wider world and shiny things, essentially. And to varying degrees, they maintain better or worse relations with those still in the movement. In some cases, they're completely ostracized and all ties are severed, either by them or the community they leave. However, many of them end up existing in a kind of twilight existence, caught between the two. They end up on welfare or involved in petty crime, or they end up working some sort of pretty menial jobs within the normal society, or a combination of those three things. And they end up fairly disaffected. They've dropped out in many senses, culturally and in terms of civic participation and so on. They drop out in that regard, but they don't replace it with anything, and they actually end up fairly unhappy people, fairly disgruntled people as a result. And there are all sorts of issues to do with drug abuse and alcoholism and so on and so forth. Now, this is because of the influences or lack thereof growing up. They didn't get the benefits of either normal society with its moral norms, or a proper commune environment where they set up a different set of norms, but they still have norms. Instead, they're essentially left to run feral. And and become stupid and lazy by their own feral, stupid, lazy parents in many cases. Sometimes their parents are idealistic and they just don't, and they don't expect the outcomes. But in a lot of cases, it's just because their parents were pretty useless themselves, and so the kids end up being pretty useless. In some cases, actually, they end up a lot worse, and that's because their parents grew up in a time when society was it had stricter norms, and they were raised within that society, and so even to some extent, they received some of that programming, but their own kids essentially exist in a complete moral vacuum, and so they don't even get that little bit, and they become even worse because they're just completely off the leash, the second generation. And actually, we see a strange parallel with this with immigrants, and the second generation of immigrants, their children, particularly Mohammedans, but other groups also, whereby their parents had the verve to move to a new place, and they were going to start a new life and do something, make something of themselves. They wanted to work hard, maybe start a business, something like that. And to some extent, they wanted to integrate. It didn't always work out that way, or they had different ideas about what integration actually was compared to the broader society. But nevertheless, we frequently see that the first generation is not too bad. They're not too good either, but they're not too bad. They generally don't engage in too much antisocial behaviour, although that also occurred in a time when society's norms were different. Multiculturalism wasn't as prevalent as it is now. It was very much about integration back then, and also there weren't as many of them, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, as we're seeing now, particularly with things like terrorism, there are a lot of homegrown terrorists in the West. And these are kids who frequently ended up with better educations than their parents. A lot of the time their parents were quite illiterate. They ended up with a better level of education and comfort and all of these sort of things, but they still became feral. It's a strange parallel, actually, between people who dropped out as hippies and so on in the 60s and 70s in the West. Now, I've known a number of people who have witnessed this kind of thing. I'm talking about the hippies and their children now, rather than the Mohammedans. So I've known a number of people who have witnessed this, or been on the receiving end of the feral children of hippies and petty crime and so on. However, I'm primarily going to talk about a place I visited in Queensland, one of these places that's still around to this day. And it's been there since the 70s, I believe. So I'll tell you a little about this place. I'm not going to tell you the name of it. You could probably find out. But nevertheless, this place, it was in the middle of nowhere. It was way out in the countryside, in the hinterland. Though not too far from some small towns, though they were pretty small, if I remember correctly. It was set on several hundred acres of land, and there were a couple of hundred residents there. So I had heard about this place, and as I mentioned earlier, I went to Queensland with my girlfriend at the time for a vacation, and then we went to this place because it wasn't too far away, and I had heard about it, and I found out where it was. So ahead of time, I also arranged for us to do a tour with one of the residents there. And that guy, he was, at the time, I think he was probably in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, but probably late 50s. So I think he was a baby boomer, I guess, at that time, approximately. And he seemed like one of those guys who was idealistic to some extent. I mean, you'd have to be, obviously, to end up in a commune. But he was also very hardworking. He was an incredibly hardworking guy, I could tell this. So the thing that he did primarily, he had a number of things going on, but the main thing I remember and that he showed us was he grew many different varieties of bamboo, a whole lot of different varieties of bamboo, both clump and running bamboo, and some varieties that were used in construction or some things like that, or for the fibers, or some that you could eat. And he I think his primary source of income was by selling these to Chinese restaurants. And some of you may be aware that they eat bamboo in Chinese cuisine. So that's what he did primarily. And it seemed like there was a pretty involved task, what he did. And he showed us around to the different areas with different types of bamboo and so on, and told us about all of those. But he also spent a lot of his time trying to deal with the common areas of this place, because it was set on several hundred acres. And the setup was that people had their own individual houses and plots of land, both around the houses, and some others had these sort of areas where they did something, they grew something there, or they grazed animals or whatever. But they had their own private land in a sense, but there was also common land. And there was always a lot of vegetation that needed to be cleared away in this common land, primarily for two reasons. One was to prevent bushfires from coming through and destroying everything, including people's houses, but also to stop various invasive species of plants from coming in and getting into areas where people were trying to grow things and so on and so forth. So there was a massive amount of work that needed to be done constantly, because it was in Queensland, so it was subtropical, and everything grows really quickly there and so on and so forth. So this work always needed to be done, and there were only a handful of people, including this particular guy doing the tour with us, to actually go in there and do all this work all the time. It was constant. It never let up of clearing away all this vegetation and doing something with it, either composting it or burning it, right? So they could never do it because there weren't enough of them to do this, and there were all of these other people. It was work for dozens of people, if not more. But there were only half a dozen or something like that actually doing the work, from what I can remember him saying, because there were a lot of free riders who were they just let other people do that work. Likewise, there were some buildings at this place that were for common use. There was some sort of reception area, and they had some shops or something there. And outsiders could come there and visit, and they had functions and that sort of stuff there. So when we were at that part of the village, he told me there was something there. It was like a pizza oven or a bakery or something. It was something to do with baking some food. And he told me it took them something like a decade to finally build this thing, because no one could agree on what they were going to do. They'd have all these meetings, and they'd have a meeting every 6 months or something, and nothing would come of the meeting because no one could agree on where they were going to do it, how much it was going to cost, who was going to do it, just all these little details, right? They were always caught up in disagreements over this. And I got the feeling when I spoke to this guy about various things such as that, he just sort of volunteered information, because I'd say, what's that thing, or how did that come into being, or whatever, right? So he would volunteer a lot of information. I guess that's part of the tour, right? But I got the feeling that he was fairly disgruntled about a lot of this stuff, because he and a handful of other people there were more than pulling their weight. They were working really hard, these guys. And then there were a bunch of people doing nothing. Or he and some other people had certain ideas about things that would actually benefit the entire community, but needed significant numbers of people in the community to all get together and to actually do them. And they wouldn't, and it was more than half a dozen people could pull off by themselves. And so it was greatly frustrating for him, from what I could tell. And I also asked him about the kinds of people who lived there, what they did there, because not everybody grew something. Like, he showed me some other thing where there was a big bit of land and some guy kept cattle there, and he said, that's Fred's bit of land, and he has some cattle there. So I knew that some people did stuff like that. There were people like the guy doing the tour who worked hard and were productive and so on. But I wondered what everyone else there did, right? Because it seemed like they didn't do very much, a lot of them. And he said a lot of the original residents had left, and then some others had moved in. And then he said there were people like him who were productive. And then there were other people who lived there but who worked elsewhere, so they went out of the commune type place, whatever you want to call it, the village, and they went to the towns or wherever, or they worked on other people's farms or something like that. So they worked outside of the commune. And then there were other people, and it sounded like there were quite a few of these people who were on welfare of some description. And sometimes they had kids, pardon me, and they're on welfare because I imagine that back in the 70s, this land had cost a pittance to buy, and they built some houses, and the houses were probably relatively cheap. And so, and if you lived out there and you got welfare, you could eke out an existence easily enough. I mean, it wouldn't be particularly great, but you could eke out an existence there. And I think that's what quite a few people were doing. So, one of the problems with self-sufficiency is that it is a lot of work. Being a farmer of any kind is really hard work. It often involves pretty bad weather. It's really hot in summer, really cold in winter. Often you get up well before dawn. You have to go to bed really early. There's little material reward at the end of it. Farmers don't make a lot of money. Most of them don't make much money. Many are actually in a lot of debt. And then there's all this uncertainty involved too. Annual variations in the climate, or natural disasters. Fires, floods, droughts. All of that sort of stuff. And fluctuating commodity prices. So, one year you might get a lot of money for your whatever wheat or beef or whatever. Another year you might get very little, right? So, it's a very unpredictable kind of business as well. And, that's a reason why farmers everywhere in the world are not producing the next generation of farmers. That's why the average age of farmers in the West is really high. And I notice it around where I am in Taiwan as well, because I live in a rural community here. The farmers are old. There are very few young farmers here, because it's hard work. It doesn't pay that well. It's very unpredictable. And, by extension, civilization is not something that's built by one person alone. Civilization is a hard thing to build. It's a hard thing to maintain. It does take a massive number of people to actually keep civilization running along. It usually involves a division of labor, a real division of labor, where people have to become very specialized. And in that regard, it's very easy to forget where the things that we have that are at our fingertips, everything that's at our fingertips, it's very easy to forget where these things came from, how they got here, and so on and so forth. But, there's a massive chain of people involved. Any single thing you have in front of you right now probably involved a huge chain of people and industries and so on to produce that one little thing. At other times, it requires people to sort of chip in and accomplish more than the sum of their individual parts. So what they would be able to accomplish as individuals added together, it's a lot more than that actually. And so, if people aren't really willing to commit to this, to being productive both as individuals and as a community, or to come together to look after the commons, or to work on major projects, building an oven, then the handful of people who will try to do those things, they won't be sufficient to maintain, let alone advance, civilization. Now, one of the principles of permaculture is that you want to get as close as possible to a closed system, such that you neither have to add nor subtract resources from a system. So if you're constantly having to bring in resources, then that's actually not a very well-designed system in terms of permaculture. And what I'm getting to here was that this was clearly the case with that village. Most people there hadn't really dropped out of society. I mean, they thought that they had, but they actually hadn't, particularly in those instances where people were on welfare, because, they're literally getting money from society in that instance without doing anything in return, in those instances without doing anything in return. So those people were actually heavily dependent upon society. If society were to collapse tomorrow or disappear tomorrow, then those people would really be up the creek. Even the well-intentioned hard-working people there, such as the guide, those people would probably be in a lot of trouble also, because there was just too much for them to be able to accomplish it all without help from others. And maybe if they'd had proportionally less lands, they would have been able to take care of these common areas, and they would have been able to build projects and so on, and really get things under control. But even then, they may not have had enough people with the required skills or resource production capacity to get everything done, because you need a certain number of people engaged in a certain number of tasks. So you can't only have 50% of those tasks being done, but you just need a certain number of people just to be able to get each task done. So, there's a sort of a scale issue there as well. So, these guys actually hadn't dropped out of society in this permaculture village, because many of them were not actually doing anything, and even those who were either going elsewhere to do it or sort of struggling to do the work of 10 people where they were, and so they were actually really dependent upon society in that regard. I mean, sure, they had things like, some of them had solar panels or whatever, or they had their own water systems and that kind of stuff, but they were still importing resources. Essentially, they weren't completely self-sufficient. Nothing like being completely self-sufficient. So to bring it back to the kids of these people, they would have seen and heard and experienced all of this firsthand, right? They would have grown up amongst this. So what would have become of those people? I mean, some of them did remain. He did say that there were some kids who had grown up there and were still there, but many had left. Now, why would that be? Well, in the case of the children of the really hardworking people there, some of those people, they might have stayed, but many of them would have said, well, my parents have been working really hard all the time, and the sense of community here is actually not that great. That's one of the ostensible reasons why we're here. But it's not that great because people don't actually chip in and help each other, and a lot of people are really antisocial, and some of our neighbours have feral kids and this kind of stuff. And they might have thought, my parents worked really hard for all of this, and they didn't get that much out of it. I don't want to be a sucker like my parents, and they would have been drawn away to mainstream society. They may have been somewhat involved in alternative living, but I imagine they would have been fairly disillusioned by the whole experience of growing up in that society. In the case of the children of other people, again, they would have observed certain things, and they would have reacted to those, whether consciously or unconsciously. They would have reacted to those. So, if they thought that their parents weren't really that committed to the commune, if they didn't deal with the common areas and pitch in that regard, if they didn't sort of grow all their own food and that kind of thing, then, why would they have suddenly decided to do something different? Unless they had become really good friends with one of the people from the hard-working families who were really committed to the commune, and maybe decided to copy them instead, which is not that likely. They probably would have ended up like their parents, both for genetic and cultural reasons. Why would they have become committed to the commune if their parents weren't? So at best, those people might have seen it as a sort of a nice place to live, or kind of a quirky place to live, but they would have aspired to have a normal job, like their parents who worked outside. At best, that's probably what would have happened to many of them. On the other hand, at worst, and obviously there'll be some sort of gradient here, at worst they would have aspired to being on welfare like their parents, who were often single mothers, I should add. This guy did say there were a few single mothers there. They would have just aspired to be on welfare like their single mothers, their single mothers who were raising them. And, they just, because that's what they would have grown up with, and that's what they would have thought was normal, and they would have aspired to nothing different to that. And it's important at this point to note that their parents, the people who ended up in a commune in the middle of nowhere on welfare, still going into the town, because this guy said people would still go into the nearby town and buy food at the supermarket. So someone who ended up on a commune in the middle of nowhere on welfare, going into the town to buy food and then bring it back to the commune, rather than growing any themselves, not actually doing any work all day. I don't know what they did. That it's important to note that kind of person, those kinds of people, they don't drop out of society and join a commune for ideological reasons, right? I mean, they might claim that. Initially, they might claim that, or they might have to maintain that lie, particularly with all the people in the commune. But they don't drop out of society to do that if they don't actually put it into action, if they don't then produce their own food, if they don't then try to sort of live an eco-friendly life and all of this sort of stuff, because if you're still driving to the town and buying stuff in plastic packaging and bringing it back and, all that sort of stuff, what are you really doing? But that's not why they did it. The reason those people drop out and live that kind of life is because they were essentially lazy and didn't want to work, and they thought that they had found a solution to that. They thought they had found a magic bullet. They weren't going to do some 9-to-5 job, man. I'm going to go out and grow my own food, and then oh no, that's too hard. I'll just get welfare. That's what they were thinking, right? And so their kids would have observed all of that, and they would have taken in those values, even at an unconscious level, particularly at an unconscious level, and, input in, output out, you are what you eat, all of that kind of stuff, right? And so the kids would have got off on the wrong foot to start with. And even beyond that, though, in more general terms, as I mentioned earlier on in this talk, the kids would have been raised in a fairly moral-free zone, often largely due to the fact that they were raised by single mothers, because without having a strong male authority in the household, a lot of kids in single mother households end up pretty feral. And also because single mothers, almost by definition, except in a few cases where, I don't know, they're widowed or something like that, or maybe they're all right and then the guy does actually run off on them or something. But then that's also an error of judgment in ending up with that kind of guy. By definition, single mothers are pretty much immoral and short-sighted. And so, they are going to raise their kids in a fairly moral-free zone. And, what's the effect of that? The single mothers, at least to some extent, or the parents who are on welfare in a commune going to the town to buy food, with welfare, to some extent they still had some moral upbringing from the society around them. I don't know how much, but they still had some within the broader society. But their children, they didn't have any of that, so the children grew up feral as a result. And the important thing to note here is that if you put kids in a moral vacuum, they're not going to magically grow up to be good people. An occasional one will, right? Of course, occasionally people are different. But generally speaking, they're not going to grow up to be good people. They're going to grow up to be people without any morals, or who have a set of so-called morals that set of morals really is just a mask or a justification for feral behavior. They'll be into socialism just because they essentially want legalized theft, right? So that's what's going to happen, and that is what happens to those kids. Both my experiences firsthand, listening to this guy, or I guess that's secondhand, listening to this guy tell me about some of this stuff and reading between the lines, or working within the education system and seeing this kind of stuff, or hearing it from friends of mine who went to some of these places. There are a couple of these places that are more well known, the sort of towns that became kind of counterculture towns in the 1970s and so on, in northern New South Wales. And one of my friends went to one of these places once, and did they steal his car? They broke into his car. Something to do with his car. They stole something from him anyway, all these guys, and some of them got really abusive, and there have been instances in the media. I remember a few years ago, some media celebrity went to one of these towns on vacation because they're near the beach and stuff, and he got attacked. He got the crap beaten out of him by some of these feral youth, children of hippies. It sounds like that movie Children of Men with the one set in England. It's this sort of dystopian thing where no one has children. It sounds like that, it's like this big war zone. You can make one Children of Hippies, where you go to a nice seaside vacation town and you get accosted by a bunch of drug-addled illiterate feral youth, whose parents were, into dropping out of society. Um, but, all of this sort of stuff, experiencing this firsthand or hearing it secondhand, was pretty clear evidence of why communism and extreme liberalism and permissiveness and all of this sort of stuff just doesn't work, That's what you end up with. You end up with a society of feral youth. Maybe some of their parents are idealistic, maybe, but most of them are actually just trying to avoid actually doing any work, and they just want to free load off others. But that's why that stuff doesn't work. And this was actually a time in my life before I became more red-pilled. It was sort of I had many doses of sort of a proto-red pill during that time, working in education, because you see some pretty shocking things working in schools in the West. But this sort of stuff, it slowly accumulated and gave me the fairly cynical attitude that I have today towards society and a lot of these supposedly idealistic things and people. And I think that when these kinds of communes and so on do actually work, some do, very few, but some do. When they work in the long term, it's because they have very strong communities based upon very strong moral codes, usually religious, probably almost always religious actually, that are strictly enforced and where there are consequences and all of that sort of stuff. And where they truly reject the safety net of broader society. Because, as long as you can collect your welfare check, as long as you can go to a supermarket and it's stocked with food, then you're not actually dropping out of society, and you don't actually have to become self-sufficient and all of that sort of thing. It's just, you can tell people that you live in an eco-village, right? You can tell people that you're self-sufficient, so that you can morally signal, but you're not really. And so to bring this back to the alt-right, I think the people who do this kind of thing won't be able to go in for self-sufficiency because of the sheer level of work involved. There's an enormous amount of work involved, and to the point where it would actually be really hard going, and you'd have a miserable life. Not just that you wouldn't have instant gratification, you'd have no gratification a lot of the time, If I were to do this sort of thing, as I mentioned before, it would involve things that I could sensibly manage myself, whilst still being fairly tapped into society, though not completely, for most things, because there are things that are just going to be much easier and cheaper and so on for society to produce than any one individual. I think that if you're going to do this whole kind of permaculture thing, then you'd want to have loose associations with other people. That's probably the way to go. Maybe if you want to make it bigger, make it some sort of economically viable enterprise, which would probably still involve selling to normies. But I would very much avoid formal associations, an actual proper commune type thing, because you're just going to end up like that guy who gave me the tour at that place, where you're going to grumble to strangers about how no one else cuts the weeds, that kind of thing, or how it took 10 years to build a pizza oven or whatever that thing was. Because there are always going to be free riders. These kinds of things, communes and the political ideologies and so on that go along with them, are like a magnet for free riders. A lot of people go to those either because they want power over others, or because they essentially want to free ride off those other people. And there are ways and means of dealing with those people, but they're fairly socially unacceptable in this day and age. So until everything changes, I don't think that's something that could really be solved. So those are my thoughts about the children of hippies and about permaculture and so on. I think as I said, it's something worth investigating, because I don't think people should be 100% tapped into the normal economy and society, but trying to actually drop out, even if you are hardworking and sensible and so on and so forth, you're going to be saddled with a bunch of losers a lot of the time. That's actually going to be really bad for you. So anyway, those are my thoughts on all of that. I hope that has answered some of your questions. Bleakunending, and to everyone else, as always, please comment beneath this video, and thank you for listening.